We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Beis in Meseches Horayos. This is Horayos Daf 7b. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah made a distinction between a situation where the Kohen Gadol issues a mistaken ruling for himself and follows that ruling, in which case he has to bring the carbon, and then you have a case where he issued the mistaken ruling together with the tzibor, together with the Sanhedrin, and so then he's included in the carbon of the tzibor. And the Gemara in the previous Amud asked, what exactly is the situation? Because if he, the Kohen Gadol, is a distinguished scholar, and the Bezdin, the Sanhedrin, is not, so then their ruling is nothing. And if it's the reverse, let's say they are distinguished and he is not, so then his ruling is nothing. So what exactly are we talking about? And the Gemara now answers, Amar Rapapa says, Kagon Shahayu Mufloin Shnei, in the cases where they're both equally distinguished. And Rashi explains, Amar Rapapa says, Bishavin, they're equal. To whom Muflo Vehein Mufloim. He's distinguished and they are distinguished. Hilka Chitzrich Lemisni, therefore the Mishnah needs to teach, Techichata Bifnei Atzmo, if he sins on his own, he's the one that issues the mistaken ruling and not the court. Afal Gav de Hora, did too have a Hora Malya, even though they also issued a real ruling. Again, as we said, that was in a different case. They issued rulings in different cases. Afilu Achi Mischaper Bifnei Atzmo, nevertheless, he brings his own kapara, Mishum de Kamoru Bishnei Isuri, because they're issuing rulings with regards to two separate Isurim. But Chata Im Hatzibur, but if he sins with the community, meaning they're issuing the same ruling, Afagav Dehum Mufli, even though he is distinguished, the Hora Didei Hava Hora Malya, that his ruling is a real ruling, Afilu Achi Mischaper Matzibur, nevertheless, his kapara is together with the Tzibur, Mishum de Kamoru B'chad Isur, because they're both issuing rulings in the same Isur. And the Gemara continues, Savar Abaye Lamemar, Abaye thought to say, Chata b'fnei atzmo v'yasa b'fnei atzmo hechidami. What exactly is the case where he sins on his own, and meaning to say he issues the ruling on his own and he acts in accordance with his ruling, with the ruling on his own? What exactly is the situation? The Yasvi b'shnei mekomos, that's talking where they're sitting in two different locations. The Kohen Gadol's in one location, the Bezin in another location, v'kamoru b'trei Yisuri, and they're also issuing rulings with regards to two separate Yisurim. That's what Abaye thought to say. Amar le Rava said to him, he said to Abaye, Atu shnei mekomos gorman, do you think two locations is what causes this halacha to be true? El afilu yosvi v'chad makom, even if they were sitting in one place, v'kevon de kamoru b'trei Isuri, as long as they're issuing rulings with regards to two different Isurim, chet b'fnei atzmahu, that's considered an independent sin, so to speak, and he brings his own carbon. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Pshita, it is obvious, hu b'chelev v'hein ba'avodas kochavim, let's say his ruling is with regards to chelev, and their ruling is with regards to avodah zara, then chet b'fnei atzmahu, then that's his own sin, that's separate, to hachalukin b'tamayu, v'chalukin b'karbonos, because they're different in terms of the psukim, the source, they're also different in terms of the karbonos which are brought, to hu b'par v'hein b'par v'soher, because in such a case he would bring a par, they would bring a par and a soher, to hakam maisu hani soher, v'hu lo maisi, they're bringing that soher, he is not, v'chol shekain, and certainly hu b'avodas kochavim, if his ruling, his mistaken ruling concerned avodah zara, v'hein b'chelev, and theirs was with chelev, the chalukin b'karbonos, saying that they have distinct karbonos, to hu seira, because he brings a seira, female goat, v'inu par, and they bring a par, a bull, so it's obvious those are distinct rulings, and therefore it would be considered an independent ruling of his, and he would have to bring his own carbon. Elahu b'chelev ha'mechasas hakar, but let's say he issues a mistaken ruling by chelev, but the part of the chelev that covers the innards, v'hein b'chelev shal hadakin, and they issue a ruling with regards to chelev also, but it's the chelev that's on the small intestines. So mahu, what would be the halacha there? Is that an identical ruling or different rulings? Mi'amrina, do we say afagav de karbonon shava, even though it's the same carbon, kevan demitrei kroi kasu, since these violations come from two different psukim, hapligin b'taymayu, so that's different reasons, that's different sources. Oh, Dilmar, maybe shem chelev echadu, it's all chelev, so it's all one. And im tim salomar shem chelev echad, if you're going to say all chelev is one, hu bechelev v'hein bedam mahu, what if he issues a ruling by chelev and they issue a ruling by blood? What's the halacha? Mi'aminan b'taymayu hapligin, do we say again they come from different reasonings, meaning different psukim? O dilmar, maybe kevan deshavan b'carbon, since they have the same carbon, basar carbon azlin, and we follow the carbon. And the Gemara says teiku, the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah mentioned she'ein bezdin chayav, and the bezdin is not chayiv at sheyoru levatel mixas or lekayim mixas. They have to issue a mistaken ruling that nullifies part of the mitzvah but still maintains part of the mitzvah. They can't completely uproot the mitzvah. Minolan, from where do we know the ad sheyoru levatel mixas or lekayim mixas? That it has to be a scenario where they issue a ruling that nullifies some but maintains some, and that we already answered earlier. Says the Gemara kedamrin and beidach pirkan, like we said in the other parak. V'nelam davar v'lo kol haguf. We learn from v'nelam helam davar, it means the matter, but not the entire concept of the mitzvah, not that they're uprooting the entirety of the mitzvah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'chein HaMashiach." This rule is true also by the Kohen Gadol. Minolan, from where do we know that this rule is true by the Kohen Gadol as well? D'chsiv, because it's written li'ashmas ha'am. It says by the Kohen Gadol, it says li'ashmas ha'am, talking about the people. And so we understand Harei Mashiach Ketzibur. The rules by the Kohen Gadol in this regard are the same as with the public, as mentioned earlier. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, "V'lo ba'avodas kochavim v'chulu," and not by avodah zara. And the Gemara says, "Minolan." From where do we know this? Meaning by avodah zara, how do we know this halacha that it has to be levatel mixas and lakayim mixas? It can't be the whole thing. T'tana Rabbanan, because we learned the rabbis taught in the following brisa, lefisha yotza avodas kochavim lodon ba'atzma, because avodah zara has its own distinct halachas with this regard in terms of mistaken rulings. Yachol yehu chayavin al akiras mitzvah kula. So one might think avodah zara is different, and therefore even when it comes to uprooting the whole mitzvah, it's going to be unique, and they would be chayiv even if the entire mitzvah was uprooted through this mistaken ruling. Nemar kan me'ene v'nemar lahalon me'ene. It says over here the words me'ene, and it says me'ene in the v'nelam dover me'ene hakol when it talks about the communal sin. Ma'alahalon bebezdin afkanami bebezdin, just like over there it's in bezdin, so to over here in bezdin. Umalahalon dover v'lo kol aguf, and just like over there it means to say not the entirety of the mitzvah. Afkanami dover v'lo kol aguf, so to over here also it's not the entirety of the mitzvah. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ein chayovin ela al helam davar im shigagas hamaisa. When it comes to the par helam davar shel tzibor, they're only liable to bring the carbon if there's helam davar, again a mistaken ruling by the court, together with a mistaken action. V'chein hamashiach, and that rule applies to the Kohen Gadol as well. V'lo ba'avodas kochavim, and the same thing is true by avodah zara. Ein chayovin ela al helam davar im shigagas hamaisa. Again, they're only going to be liable if there's helam davar, there's that mistaken ruling, together with shigagas maisa, together with an action that is based on that ruling. And Rashi explains, Ein chayavin bekarbon, ein bezdin. It means that ein bezdin chayavin carbon. The bezdin is not chayav a carbon. Ela al helam davar shigas maisa, unless you have again both helam davar and shigas maisa. V'chein hamashiach, and that's true by the Kohen Gadol as well. V'tzibor hu d'chi avdi b'shigas maisa l'chudei. Now by the tzibor, let's say it's just shigas maisa. Let's say there's no helam davar. Then maisu kol chad v'chad kispo seira. Then they all bring a personal chatas, a female sheep or a female goat. The dineihem ki yechidim. They're judged as individuals. The kaven the loas al pi bezdin mechalke kulu mehadadi v'havu yechidim, since they're not acting based on the court, so they're all divided, they're all individuals. V'yechidim chayavin b'shigas maisa, and individuals are chayiv by shigas maisa. Aval Mashiach, but by the Kohen Gadol b'shigas maisa lechudei. Let's say there would not be a mistaken ruling; it would just be a shogeg pater miklum. He'd actually be completely pater. Kiramar lekaman b'perak basra me'amoritz pral Mashiach, like we're going to learn from the pasuk coming up. De'eno mevi b'shigas maisa klal. By shigas maisa, Kohen Gadol doesn't bring it all. V'hainu dekamar yotza Mashiach shein chataso b'shgaga. That's what it means when it says the Kohen Gadol is excluded because his chatas is not b'shogeg. Dahainu b'shigagas maisa. That is a reference to shigagas maisa. And the Gemara says, Minolan, from where do we know this halacha? The Tanu Rabbanon, because the rabbis taught, Yishku, it says they make a mistake. Yachol Yehu Chayavin al Shigagas Maisa. One might think they're chayiv just for the mistaken action. Talmud Lomar Yishku v'nelam davar. It says Yishku v'nelam davar. Ein Chayavin el al helam davar im Shigagas Maisa. It has to be both helam davar and Shigagas Maisa. And again, this is by the bezdin. This is the par helam davar shel tzibor. V'chein hamashiach, and this halacha is true also by the Kohen Gadol. Minolan, from where do we know that? Because it's written li'ashmasa again by the Kohen Gadol. Sin, it talks about the sin of the nation. Harei Mashiach Ketzibur. So you see that the Kohen Gadol is treated like the public in this respect. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'lo ba'avodas kochavim." The same thing is true by avodah zara. Ela al helam davrim shigagas maisa. It's got to be both helam davar and shigagas maisa. And the Gemara says, "Minolim." From where do we know this? The Tanu Rabbanon, because the rabbis taught, "L'fi sheyotza avodas kochavim lodin bi'atzma," because avodah zara is set aside. It's unique and it has its own laws. It's not the exact same laws as the regular situation of the par helam davar shel tzibor. So therefore, yachol yuchayavin al shigagas maisa. One might think by avodah zara just shigagas maisa they're liable. Nemar kan me'ene, it says over here me'ene, v'nemar lahalon me'ene, it says over there me'ene. Ma lahalon ein chayavin ela al helam davar im shigagas maisa. Just like by the regular par helam davar shel tzibor, it's helam davar and shigagas maisa. Afkan so to by avodah zara, so to here ein chayavin ela al helam davar im shigagas maisa. They're only going to be liable with helam davar and shigagas maisa. And the Gemara continues, V'ilu Mashiach. Now, whereas by the Kohen Gadol, ba'avodas kochavim lo katani masnisin, there's nothing mentioned about avodah zara by the Kohen Gadol. The Mishnah, when it talks about avodas kochavim, when it talks about avodah zara, so it's talking what? It's talking about a situation of the par helam davar shel tzibor. And so therefore, masnisin mani. So the Gemara asks, who is the author of our Mishnah? And the Gemara says, Rebbe here. Our Mishnah is actually Rebbe. The Tanya, because we learned in a Braisa, Mashiach ba'avodas kochavim. What about if you had to have a Kohen Gadol issuing a mistaken ruling for himself by avodah zara, acting upon that ruling? What would be? Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says, b'shigagas ma'isa. Rebbe says, actually, by the Kohen Gadol by avodah zara, it's just through shigagas ma'isa. The Chachamim Omerim behelam davar, but the Chachamim say, no, there's helam davar over there as well. It has to be helam davar and shigagas ma'isa. V'shavin shebeseira. Now both agree that the carbon that's brought is a seira, a female goat. V'shavin she'ein mevi asham talui. And also both agree that he is not going to bring an asham talui. And Rashi explains, V'ilu Mashiach ba'avodas kochavim lo katani, when it comes to the Kohen Gadol by avodah zara, that's not mentioned in the Mishnah. To katani v'lo ba'avodas kochavim shein chayav mela al helam davrim shigas ma'isa. By the tzibor, we talk about the fact that by avodah zara it has to have helam davr and shigas ma'isa. V'lo katani v'chein hamashiach. It doesn't say that's also true by the Kohen Gadol. Umidolo katani v'chein hamashiach, from the fact it doesn't say that this is also true by the Kohen Gadol. Mechlal the Mashiach ba'avodas kochavim chayav b'shigas ma'isa l'chudei. That implies that by the Kohen Gadol by avodah zara, the chiyav actually is just with shigagas ma'isa. Masnisin mani, Rebbe, the Mishnah is Rebbe. Titania Mashiach ba'avodas kochavim, Rebbe Omer b'shigagas ma'isa l'chudei. Rebbe says by the Kohen Gadol by avodah zara, just shigagas ma'isa is what obligates him. V'chachamim Omerim behelam davar kolomar im shigagas ma'isa. The Chachamim say helam davar together with shigagas ma'isa, kashar mitzvahs like other mitzvahs. V'shavin she'ein mevi shum asham talui. Also, they both agree that when it comes to a Kohen Gadol, he never brings an asham talui. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'tizbra, is this really logical? And what the Gemara means to ask is, can you really make this inference from the Mishnah? Can you say that since the Mishnah didn't say V'chein HaMashiach when it comes to Avodah Zarah, therefore we can infer that our Mishnah follows Rebbe, that Shigagas Maisa alone by a Kohen Gadol by Avodah Zarah, that's enough to be Mechayev him? Is that really logical? Bizdono Karis of Shigagaso Chatos, but we're also going to have halacha that it only applies, these halachas only apply in an Aveira, where if you do it on purpose you get Karis, and if you do it b'shogeg you get a Chatos. But mikatani, does it say over there v'chein hamashiach? It doesn't say that over there. Elatani ha hu adin laha. It says it in one place, and we assume in the other place. Hachanami here also tana ha v'hu adin laha. You learn it in one place, and therefore you assume in the other place. Meaning to say, once it says v'chein hamashiach in the middle of the Mishnah over here, so then we assume v'chein hamashiach applies by avodah zarah as well at the end of the Mishnah. Rashi explains v'tizbra zedona kares v'shigagaso chatas da avodas kochavim dekatani by avodah zarah by zdona kares and shigagaso chatas. It has to be something where if you do it on purpose it's a kares, and if you do it by mistake it's a chatas. So it says v'lo ba'avodas kochavim ela al davar shechayav al zdona kares ve'al shigagaso chatas. The Mishnah is going to say that by avodah zarah you're only going to bring the carbon again on something where if you would do it on purpose it would be a kares. If you do it by mistake it's a chatas. Mikotani v'chein hamashiach. Does it say the words v'chein hamashiach over there? But yet we know the halach is the Mashiach nami ba'avodas kochavim, that a Kohen Gadol also by avodah zarah eno chayiv el al davar shezdona kares v'al shigagaso chatas. He's only going to be chayiv if it's something where if you did it on purpose it's kares, and if you did it by mistake it's a chatas. Kedamin l'kamon, we're going to say that later on. Nemer kan olel yashma asam hari Mashiach ketzibur. We're going to say that later on. V'afilu achi lo katani v'masnisin v'chein hamashiach. But still it doesn't say the words v'chein hamashiach. Elatana beha. Rather the answer is that it says it over here, meaning b'davar shechayav al zdona kares v'shigagaso chatas b'shar mitzvahs. It has that same requirement by other mitzvahs, that it has to be zdona kares v'shigagaso chatas, and it says over there v'chein hamashiach. It uses the word v'chein hamashiach. V'hu adin b'avodas kochavim, and you're going to say the same thing by avodah zarah. The Mashiach ketzibur, that the Kohen Gadol is like the tzibur. The eno chai b'avodas kochavim ela b'davar shezdona kares v'shigagaso chatas. That by avodah zarah also he's only going to be chayiv if it's something which is, if it's b'mezid it's kares, and if by mistake it's a chatas. And hachanami tana b'ha dein chayavin b'shar mitzvahs el al helm davram shigas maisa. It says again you're only chayiv by other mitzvahs if you have both helm davar and shigas maisa v'chein hamashiach, and it says the words v'chein hamashiach v'hu adin la'avodas kochavim, and the same is true by avodah zarah. The Mashiach ketzibur, that the Kohen Gadol is like the tzibur. Ki hechi dein bezdin chayavin al avodas kochavim el al helm davram shigas maisa. Just like we say again, the bezdin is not chayiv unless you have both helm davar and shigas maisa. It's true also by the Kohen Gadol. Udelo Rebbe, and the Mishnah may not be like Rebbe. And the Gemara continues, my time with the Rebbe, what's the reason of Rebbe? Why does Rebbe say that if a Kohen Gadol sins by avodah zarah, just shigagas ma'isa alone, he brings a carbon? And the reason is Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, "V'chiper haKohen ala nefesh hashogeges b'chota b'shgaga," and we understand that pasuk to mean hanefesh. What does it mean? The soul. The person sins. This pasuk is talking about avodah zarah. Zeh Mashiach, that comes to include the Kohen Gadol. Hashogeges, and when it says Hashogeges, Zeh Nasi, that includes the Nasi. Bechata b'shgaga, and then it says that the sin was b'shogeg. Rebbe Sava, Rebbe holds Chet Zeh b'shgaga yehay. This Chet, this sin, is going to be b'shogeg. We'll see Rashi in a moment. V'Rabbanan Savri, and the Rabbanan hold Misha Chataso b'shgaga. What the pasuk means is the one who in general brings karbonos when he sins b'shogeg. Yotza Mashiach, this excludes the Kohen Gadol. She'in Chataso b'shgaga, his sin is generally not just b'shogeg, ela behelam davar, rather there's helam davar as well, there's a mistaken ruling. And before we see Rashi, we'll take a look at the psukim. The pasuk says, "V'im nefesh achas techeta b'shgaga." If a soul sins b'shgaga, in the context of this pasuk is sinning in avodah zarah. V'hikriva eiz bas shenasa lechatos. What's brought is a female goat. And then the pasuk continues, "V'chiper hakohen ala nefesh hashogeges b'cheta b'shgaga l'fnei Hashem lechaper olav v'nislachlo." And that's the argument between Rebbe and the Chachamim how to darshan this pasuk. And Rashi explains, "My time at the Rebbe Omar Kra." The pasuk says, "Beparsha Shlach l'cha." It says in Parsha Shlach, "V'chiper hakohen ala nefesh hashogeges." That's the pasuk. Sava Rebbe. So Rebbe understands chata b'shgaga hachi mashma. When it says the sin is b'shogeg, it means as follows: Chet zeh b'shgaga yehei. This chet is b'shogeg. Kilomar b'shigagas ma'isa l'chudei, meaning just shigagas ma'isa va'afilo Mashiach. And again, as Rebbe said, this includes even the Kohen Gadol. V'Rabbanan Savri. Now the Rabbanan, they learn this pasuk. Misha cheto b'shgaga means somebody who his sin is normally b'shogeg. Tahachi mashma. The pasuk should be understood as follows: V'chiper hakohen al hanefesh hashogeges. To yavi seira, the Kohen is going to have a kapara for the person who sinned. That this person brings a seira b'shigagas ma'isa. Misha cheto b'shgaga b'shar mitzvah. Somebody who in general their sin is just b'shigagas ma'isa, they're going to bring the carbon over here b'shigagas ma'isa. Yotza Mashiach, that comes to exclude the Kohen Gadol. She'ein chataso b'shgaga. His sins are generally not b'shgaga b'shar mitzvahs. By other mitzvahs, there has to be helam davar. Kilomar b'shigagas ma'isa, meaning to say again, his sins are generally not just shigagas ma'isa. Ella b'helam davar im shigagas ma'isa. Rather, by the Kohen Gadol, it's helam davar with shigagas ma'isa. Dal shigagas ma'isa l'chudei pater legamri. Because by Kohen Gadol, shigagas ma'isa alone would be exempt. That's the difference between how Rebbe and the Rabbanan learned that pasuk. And the Gemara continues, the Brisa said, V'shavin shebeseira kiyachid. They both agree that the carbon that is brought as a seira is a female goat, just like an individual, meaning to say, Rebbe and the Chachamim disagree by Kohen Gadol by avodah zarah, whether it's just shigagas ma'isa, that's Rebbe, or whether it's helam davar with shigagas ma'isa, that's the Chachamim. But the carbon that is brought, everybody agrees, is a seira. And the Gemara says, Minolan, from where do we know that? The Amar Kratz, because the pasuk says, V'im nefesh achas, it says one soul, echad yachid, v'echad nasi, v'echad Mashiach. Whether we're talking about an individual, whether we're talking about a nasi, whether we're talking about the Kohen Gadol, kulam bichlal nefesh achas, and they're all included in nefesh achas. And again, that pasuk says that the animal that is brought is a seira, is a female goat. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Aleph.